Hi, and welcome to ChefConf 2021 online. Today I'm here with Kyle Ruddy talking about chefing with Terraform the new way. I'll hand over to Kyle straight away because without further ado, I think I'll just be wasting any more time. Thank you very much, Kyle. And there you go.
Sweet. Thank you very much for the intro there, Dan. Hopefully my screen share has started and we're ready to roll. First and foremost, thank you very much to all the folks at Chef for putting on a great event and allowing me as a first-time ChefConf speaker to come and talk a little bit about something that I'm passionate about, and that's Terraform. But throughout my history as a either a vSphere admin or a system engineer, there's been a lot of trials and tribulations that come along with the process of kind of adopting infrastructure as code. And there's really a great story to tell here where there's it's better together, being able to provision with Terraform and use Chef as a configuration management tool. And really we're going to kind of roll through how these two tools can be used in combination to get to that end result that we're all looking for. So my name is Kyle Ruddy, as Dan mentioned. I am part of the technical marketing group here at HashiCorp. However, I have a long history of being on the administration side, doing both server administration and infrastructure engineering. And in this session, we're talking about chefing with Terraform, the quote unquote new way. And we'll get into why those quotes are there and important here shortly. There we go. All right, so a little bit about the agenda. We're going to start off with a high level kind of about what Terraform is. I'm sure most of the people who are watching this already know what Terraform is, but thanks to the glorious nature of virtual events, kind of want to do a level set to make sure that everybody has at least a fundamental understanding about what these tools are going to be doing. Then we dive into the provisioner side because that's really where a lot of the magic happens. And that's also kind of where we stray from Terraform knowledge on most users. Provisioners are a big thing, and we'll walk through why those are a big thing there. Then we get into the new way and we wrap up with some demos. All right, so first and foremost, let's talk a little bit about Terraform, kind of lay the groundwork here, if you will, as to what this kind of whole infrastructure as code thing is when it comes to provisioning tools with Terraform. And so when you think about Terraform, you can think of this as kind of the core engine behind a provisioning tool. Everybody's going to use HCL or the HashiCorp configuration language in order to define what they want their infrastructure to look like. This is just a really easy way to automate, version, and collaborate on all the things that are going on within your infrastructure. It's human readable, meaning that I can pretty much type out whatever I want to onto the screen as long as I'm following those style and configuration points of HCL as a language, and Terraform is going to go and make sure that it happens. This is great because it's declarative, meaning that I don't need to know all of those imperative step-by-step ways to, stand up a virtual machine that we'll see in our demo. It's also idempotent, meaning that every single time you're going to get the same result on the tail end. And it's feature-rich, meaning that we can do certain things like use provisioners, which is our next step here. So what are provisioners when it comes to Terraform? So if you've looked in our docs, you'll know that provisioners are a type of resource. When it comes to Terraform, resources are those things that are being managed, either provisioned, created, lifecycle management type functionalities there. And provisioners really come to life when you're working with certain compute type resources. And when I say compute resources, I'm talking like virtual machines, machine images, those types of things. And really, what happens is you use Terraform to do the deployment, and then there's oftentimes some like extra little step that you need to perform, either like running a cloud init or, hey, we're at ChefConf, so maybe you need to get that Chef client installed. So that's where provisioners come into play because that might not be baked into that golden image, if you will. There are a couple different types of provisioners. There are some generic provisioners, things like file, local exec, and remote exec, and those do pretty much exactly what you expect. The file provisioner is going to interact with files, meaning that you can either tell it to copy a file to that virtual machine or otherwise compute resource, or you can even give it a string and it'll make it and turn it into a file on that compute instance. Then we also have local exec. This is going to allow that Terraform worker or wherever Terraform is being ran from to perform some sort of execution. Then we have the remote execution provisioner, and that's allowing Terraform to go in and run some sort of execution on the remote compute or virtual machine instance. Then we get into the vendor provisioners, and that's kind of what we're here to talk about as part of this session. And there we have some Chef related ones in Chef and Habitat, but then there's also Puppet and Salt master lists that are out there and able to be interacted with as well. However, one of the things that I want to throw out there is like provisioners may, I may have described it in a way that like sounds like a great thing and that you want to use all the time. But wait, because really, when it comes down to it, provisioners are really a last resort. And we, this is something that's covered in the Terraform documentation quite well and bolded as, as part of the provisioners overview here. Because really what it comes down to with these provisioners is, when I mentioned it's that last step to kind of kickstart something that's within that compute resource. And that's really what it is. We're kind of taking a step outside of the idempotent, immutable nature of Terraform, and we're doing something that's very, it's something that's outside of that normal cadence. So what I want to do is kind of cover some keys to remember, some core concepts here when you start thinking about using provisioners, perhaps in your own environment through Terraform. So first and foremost, this is going to add a level of complexity and uncertainty to your Terraform usage, because this is something that it depends on that remote system that's being created. And oftentimes when it comes to Terraform, that system doesn't even exist yet. It's only going to be referenced, the provisioner that is, during creation or destroy actions, meaning that this is, a really great capability for either, kicking off that cloud init, kicking off that Chef client installation, or, any other script that you really have, or it can be used as such as like a cleanup task, maybe removing some of those things from that virtual machine image. It cannot be modeled during the Terraform plan phase. And this is kind of important because this is what takes you out of that normal Terraform plan and apply, because it doesn't really know. And I'll cover this in the demo to give you kind of a high level understanding of what it looks like. But really there's nothing that Terraform can do in order to give you a reliable understanding of what that provisioner is going to do or apply to that virtual machine. There are some cases where you may run into failures, and upon failure, you may need to have an understanding of how to tell Terraform to, what it should do next. Like, should it continue with the Terraform apply phase? Should it continue like rolling out that infrastructure as it's been declared, or do you want it to fail the entire apply? That's going to be something that's very, dependent upon your infrastructure and the way that you manage it. Then provisioners also really don't have a fundamental understanding of the resources as they've been defined in Terraform. So an example, if we're using like a virtual machine, say we're using vSphere virtual machine, that's the resource type. The provisioners don't know about those different resources. However, through the magic of some of the things that are available with Terraform, you can use a self object, and Terraform kind of pushes some of those resources from that parent virtual machine into the provisioner so that you can reference things. This is really helpful when you start interacting, with those virtual machines or compute resources through like IPs or FQDN names, things of that nature. Then there are also times when you're using, like, say, remote exec, there needs to be some sort of remote connectivity going on there. It's going to primarily connect to those systems through either SSH or WinRM. Obviously, SSH is going to be your Linux-based system connection, and WinRM is going to be your Windows-based connection. So these are things that you're going to need to set up in your image previously to make sure that your SSH server is running and your firewall rules are open, or on the Windows side that WinRM can be connected to and interacted with. This also means that you need to have a user that's on there so that you can kind of, authenticate to that system. Then in certain situations, it makes sense to, instead of defining a provisioner as part of a virtual machine resource or, like an AMI resource, you may need to specify this as part of a what's known as null resource. And as part of this null resource, you can use, actually I should cover what a null resource is. It's exactly what it sounds like. It does nothing. It creates nothing. However, it allows you to call a provisioner in certain use cases, like a create action, in order for you to run that. I'm going to kind of walk through a use case of using the null resource in our demo. But another important thing there is the trigger argument. And this comes in really handy when you start thinking about some of those expressions and functions with Terraform. Like, say, if you're running a loop, you're going to want that null resource to iterate through that loop to then, process those provisioners as well. And in the end, really what it comes down to is provisioners are basically a fancy way of running a script. And I'll show that in the demo as well. It's literally just copying over like either a shell or a bash script over to that remote system and then running it. So keep that in mind as well when you're kind of developing what that provisioner is going to do, because that, at least to me, makes a whole lot more logical sense when you put that into those types of terms. Okay, so let's dive into those Chef-related provisioners, since after all, we are at Chef Conf. So first and foremost, we have the Chef provisioner. What this provisioner does is it reaches out to that compute instance and it installs, configures, and runs the Chef client. On those Linux-based systems, it's going to use SSH for the connection, and the documentation says curl, though I've seen in a couple different instances that wget is also used if it's available. On the Windows side, we're using WinRM again for the connection and PowerShell to do the configuration and setup. The Chef provisioner supports all kinds of arguments. I mean, all kinds, whether or not you want to feed in some JSON file for your attributes or your vaults configuration, you can specify different channels, you can specify user credentials, you can specify all sorts of things that are out there and available. It's rather vast. Definitely recommend checking out the documentation there. Then when we get into the Habitat side, this is where it's going to do a very similar process. However, it's going to be installing the supervisor and loading whatever those configured services are. On the Habitat side, it's only going to support Linux. And again, it's going to use SSH and curl, although as well, it's going to use T and set SID. Then there's also a wealth of arguments that are available for the supervisor and the service blocks and configurations as well. So that was a very quick run through of the provisioners and kind of what provisioners are and how it interacts. So let's get into this whole like new way. So going back a couple of months, 6 months maybe, we had a little release on the HashiCorp side. We released Terraform 1.0. This was a huge release because when it comes to HashiCorp and the 1.0 releases, what it comes down to is this really is about long-term support. Being able to give everybody the confidence of using Terraform within their infrastructures to continue with that workflow in a dependable way throughout the life cycle of the 1.x product. And that's no different with Terraform. Even though we all loved and enjoyed all the jokes because it's been a 7-year journey since 0.1 was released, or really it's been a 10-year journey if you go back to the first kind of what could be for Terraform. And so when it came down to being able to support those things and really provide this dependable workflow when it comes to Terraform, there was some cleanup that needed to be done. And with that, there were a couple of things that had to be removed. One of which actually happened to be those vendor provisioners. So here what we have is an example of running a Terraform init. This is just initializing Terraform to kind of understand what resources it's going to be using and what providers it's going to be using, what APIs it's talking to. But here we can see that the Chef provisioner has been removed as part of the 1.0 release. And technically, if you can go back and it was removed as part of 0.15. But the important part here is that we announced the deprecation going back to 0.13.4. So hopefully we've given everybody enough time to kind of, come up to date and find this new way in order to continue using Chef in their environments with Terraform. So one of the things that I also want to call out, because, occasionally there's some folks who are like, whoa, what are you doing? This is changing everything in my environment. And really, I'm going to take a line from Mitchell Hashimoto, which is, one of the co-founders of HashiCorp, as well as the creator of Terraform itself. And really, it comes down to, the story is always more complex than it seems. And Mitchell actually has a tweet that's out there and kind of, calls out, what's, the whole backstory to why we've done this, why we went down this path of removing those vendor provisioners. And really the end goal here, while I, highly recommend checking this out, if that's something that you care about deeply, it's a good read, lots of history. But in the end, those three general provisioners really do everything that you need. Do you need to run things on the Terraform worker? There's local exec. You need to run things on that remote system or remote compute instance. Remote exec can do that. Do you need to do file manipulations? File provisioner is there. So really, everything's available through that. The different provisioners, the vendor provisioners, were just more of a a nicety to maybe make that workflow or that process run a little smoother. But again, check out the gist link that's out there. Great history, but definitely, as Mitchell calls out, settle in, grab a cup of coffee or something. It's a bit of a read. So I've done enough talking. Let's dive into some demo environments and kind of walk through, kind of see the Chef Provisioner in action, as well as see what we can do with the remote exec provisioner as well. So jumping into a vSphere environment, this is going to be what I'm using for this demo. Going back to my administration days, vSphere was pretty much my core focus of managing workloads. And so this is my home lab environment. It's literally running down the hall about 10 feet. It's a home lab and it's a live environment because I've got all kinds of nasty alerts that are going on here. And let me find my mouse has seemed to disappear. There it is. Okay. All right. So we got some alerts. We've got our host. We've got a bunch of stuff that are out there running. And what we're going to be using for this demo is a couple templates. Really just the Ubuntu 18 template that I've set up and crafted and made that ready and available for us to start using and consuming through both Terraform and Chef. So then what we have our Chef environment. I'm using the hosted service out there at api.chef.io, created a Terraform demo organization and set up a couple basic policies and set up a couple clients for us to start referencing. Then to actually run our Terraform configurations, we're going to be making use of a equally hosted service called Terraform Cloud. This is going to be important for our demo because I'm going to be switching in between different Terraform versions. And instead of watching you, or instead of rather you watching me switch in between different Terraform versions, I can just use Terraform Cloud to iterate that ahead of time and make that a whole lot nicer. So we're going to start off with our Chef Provisioner. Here in our workspace here, I want to call out a couple things. We're going to be using Terraform 0.13 in order to make use of this because that removes all those deprecation notices and things from our Terraform output. So I'm going to go ahead and kick off a new plan here. And while that's running, I'm going to show you what's happening behind the scenes. I'll show you what the configuration looks like. But here in Terraform Cloud, we can literally see the output from the plan and apply phases. So it's just the equivalent of running that on our local system. This is just in a hosted remote run environment. So on our workspace over here onto the right-hand side, we have a link to the GitHub repository where I've stored my configuration code here. Instead, we're going to jump over to the Chef Provisioner branch, which actually has the code. There we go. So if we dive into our main.tf file, it's our main configuration file where we've defined the infrastructure that we want to work with here. We have our vSphere provider that's set up. That's how we interact with our vSphere environment back there. I'm setting up a couple things to deploy a virtual machine, we need to know like what data center it needs to live in, where the storage should live, where the compute resources should live in terms of resource pools, what network it should live on, where it should live VM folder wise. Here on line 39 is where we call out that template that we're going to use. We're going to clone that. Then here we have our resource block where we're actually configuring that virtual machine to set up and run. The important parts that are coming down here are our clone block here, where basically I'm taking that golden template, deploying it. I'm using some customization options to do some basic stuff like set up the host name, set up the IP addresses. By running through some of these demos, I blew out my DHCP range really quick. So go on static IPs in this case. And then down here at the bottom, we have our null resource that we're making use of. Now, generally, you can use that Chef provisioner and put that inside of the virtual machine resource within that iteration. However, one of the things that I ran into when creating this was that it actually kind of created a chicken or the egg type situation where the Chef provisioner could not kick off until the virtual machine configuration, that resource was done and completed. So like literally it is going back in between the in the logs saying, Chef provisioner waiting on virtual machine waiting on Chef provisioner. So in that case, we can kind of remove that our Chef provisioner block here and put that in the null resource so that we can make that a little nicer and a little more dependable within our system. Now, the Chef provisioner is going to, in essence, run a remote execution on our system. So it's going to be connecting to that system through our connection block here. And then we can use some of our different arguments like run list to tell it what role it should pick up, what username and key that it should be adopting, what the server URL is. And in this case, I want it to show up as a short name instead of our FQDN name. Then I also want to call out the client options. Regardless of what you're setting up in your environment, you at least have to accept the Chef license. So now if we jump, let's go into our vSphere environment, because sometimes this takes a little bit. We can see that we have our Chef Demo 01 system. It's out there. If we launch our web console, we can see that it, right there we have our name, our system name of Chef Demo 01. So it looks like our customization was successful. Then if we go back into our Terraform Cloud workspace here, we see that our latest run here, which was the one that I just performed, actually had an error. And this is going to be one of those important parts when it comes to, why the new way or using the remote exec provisioner specifically is going to be important. So clicking on see details, we see that our plan completed successfully. Just planned out 2 different resources. Since we're making use of that null resource, I want to go back up here to the top to show you what it looks like. Because again, it's this is our Chef provisioner that's being run. And that's the only thing that's part of that null resource. So what's happening is it just creates and associates the ID for that null resource, because it doesn't have the ability to run that Chef provisioner yet until the virtual machine exists. So there's nothing is happening in the plan phase when it comes to provisioners. Key concept there that you want to keep in mind. Then when we get down to our apply phase, we can run through this to kind of see what was happening. So it took about 55 seconds to run through the creation of our virtual machine. That's the clone as well as the customize. Then we get into the provisioning with the Chef provisioner. We see the Chef that's called out right there. It's connecting to the system over SSH. It takes a little bit to get over to it. Let's see, where are we at? Still creating. There we go. Finally, we hit our connected state right there. It's reaching out to the, let's see, in this case, we're using the omnitruck.chef.io to grab out the latest and greatest installer. In this case, happens to be version 17.3.48. And this is one of those areas where I do want to call out, and your Terraform output will call it out as well. That in this case, I did not specify a version for the Chef client that should be installed. So it tells us, right up there, and warning. This is not something that you should really be using in production environments, because this could, cause separation of dependencies or consistency within an environment. Then it goes through. We're just installing it with dpackage, so that we can see that there we go. Here's our thank you for installing the Chef Infra client. And then when we get down here to the bottom, it actually doesn't find the knife command. So this is one of those situations where, probably wanted to install a prior version of the Chef client instead of this one, or this could be one of those areas where perhaps the Chef provisioner isn't working as dependably as we would like. So this is where the remote execution provisioner comes into play and kind of allows us to work around this without having to wait on the provisioner to be updated. So let's go back to our Terraform Cloud environment here. I'm going to call out just specifically my Chef comp tagged workspaces. So now we're diving into our remote execution provisioner here. We're instead using Terraform version 1.0.4, which is the latest and greatest version of Terraform that's released and available as of right now. We're going to run through our plan phase here. Now, again, very similar situation. We're not going to see a whole lot different, but the differences come into play where our configuration lives. So I've already closed out of the other one. We'll go out back to our Terraform configuration here that's living out in GitHub. And we'll check out our remote exec branch here. One thing I do want to call out, these are private for the moment. I'll make them live here shortly. And if we dive into our main.tf, we're going to see the exact same configuration as before, setting up our vSphere provider, running through all of the little instances that we need to do or create and establish to create our virtual machine. We have our clone block that is right here doing the exact same thing. It's just using a variable to now instead specify Chef Demo 02. Then we have our provisioner that's been set up within that virtual machine resource block. And what's happening here is, similar situation. We're using a connection block to reach out to the cloned virtual machine through SSH. We're going to use my own username and password in this particular situation. Then we have our inline commands that we're going to be running. Now, again, provisioners boil down to just being a script. So literally what's happening here is Terraform is providing these command lines as a script to the remote system. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be running a wget to pull out the Chef client package. We're going to be setting up sudo so that we can actually install the client. Then at this point, we're going to be using wget to pull some resources from an FTP server where I have our client 02 client configuration set up, as well as the client key to make that available. And then our last big run here as part of this script is going to be to run the Chef client. So here, if we go back to our run instance here, see that we're still applying. So we've made it through the plan. So if we head over to our vSphere environment here, we should see Chef Demo 02 now exists. And I should call out that down here in the bottom, underneath our recent tasks, we can also see that this is showing up. We're using a service account to create this. So Terraform isn't like removing itself from the way the vSphere logs and creates these events and tasks on the vSphere environment. If we drop into the web console, we see that we already have Chef Demo 02 that's been set up. So it's likely made it through our configuration process. Now, here we go. So going up a little bit, we have, let's see, after about 1 minute and 20 seconds, it made it to the remote execution area of our plan and apply here. So we can now see, instead of, previously it just said chef, in this case, it's going to say remote exec. It's going to be connecting over SSH so that we can now see that it connected. It's going to be grabbing our Chef Infra client from the packages.chef.io site. I'm going to be saving that locally. Then it's going to be running through the installation process. Here again, we see that thank you for installing line right there. Then we have our wgets that are going out, reaching out to that FTP site, grabbing the client configuration as well as that client PEM, putting it in the appropriate places. And we can now see that it's running through the installation. So it's accepting the licenses for the Chef Infra client as well as InSpec, and running through the creation. Let's see. Then we get to the bottom. So it took about 1:44. Thoroughly happy with the way that my home lab is running this morning. That's great. It was taking about 5 minutes earlier when I was testing. So if we jump into our Chef, our hosted environment right here, where I'm running our Terraform demo configurations. Let's do our reload here. Theoretically, we should hopefully, there we go. We see that our Chef Demo 02 system is now registered in our Chef organization, and we can see all the bits of information about it that we would expect to see like anything else. Different IP addresses. We can see that it's using 162 that was used. It's using that static IP. We're finding the host name and the FQDN. We're seeing all the things that we would expect to see. And yep. All right. So with that, that's pretty much the demo. That's the walkthrough process of using Terraform with both the Chef provisioner as well as the remote execution provisioner to really get to that same end point where we want to be, where we want to be able to use that to interact in between Chef and that client to pass through our configurations and just manage it as we would normally. So we have some more tidbits of information because I really just scratched the surface on a lot of these things. As you could see by the demo, we didn't actually really apply any recipes or cookbooks. This was just a registration technique. Theoretically, everything is going to work exactly the same as it would as if you did it locally. So there's a ton of documentation that's out there. The provisioner documentation, this is going to be something that lives underneath the Terraform resources. And there's a wealth of information that's out there, including some of the way that other examples on how you can make use of the provisioners to get to that same end result, as well as how to make use of, perhaps the file provisioner to instead use that to get some files over to the remote system instead of using wget and a unsecured FTP server. Again, home lab, it's stuff that you can kind of get away with. Then we get into the Chef Infra documentation. They have a wonderful page dedicated to Terraform and kind of the transition in between the Chef provisioner over to what it would look like using remote exec in your own environments. Then I want to give a huge shout out and point to the HashiCorp Learn platform. This is a guide-based or walkthrough-based resource of really all the HashiCorp products. However, there are guides that are focused on not only Terraform, but also using provisioners within your environment. Great resource. Also, I want to call out a caveat there. In certain cases when using Learn, if you search for just provisioner, you're going to find a lot of Packer stuff. So there's little icons that'll designate whether it's Packer or whether it's Terraform. But in the end, it's all HCL underneath the cover. So you're likely going to be good to at least get some concepts understood there. Lastly, we have our HashiCorp Provisioner Migration Guide. I put this last because the only example that's out there right now is for Salt Masterless. However, it includes a huge block of information about some of the concepts about moving in between from a vendor provisioner to a generic provisioner that are still relevant even for folks making use of the Chef and Habitat provisioners. So that's a great resource as well. So with that, I want to thank you all very much for having me. Hopefully this was a great great session, provide a bunch of information on how to provide you kind of the best way forward, and still making use of Chef within your environment to really make use of both provisioning from an infrastructure as code side, as well as configuration management from the infrastructure as code side. So with that, let me hand it back to Dan. And again, thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Oh, thanks very much, Carl. That was super interesting. I've been waiting to see this presentation for about 2 weeks now, and I was like, right, hopefully we'll hear the story. If any, I'll reiterate, if anyone's got any time, I'd highly recommend reading the backstory that Michel Hashimoto wrote on that just there. There's some really interesting tidbits and weird timings that happened. I'm not going to spoil the story, but there's a reason why there's only really a chef provision in there, which is really cool. Thank you very much again for speaking this year at ChefConf 2021 online, Kyle. Does anyone in the audience have any questions? Just feel free to drop them in the chat below, and I'll just allow everybody to feel free to just unmute and talk if you want as well. I'll give you a few minutes as well, and we'll just do some filler music at this time. That's fine. But yeah, that was it's nice that the remote provisioner sort of works in sort of the plan phase now. The fact that the chef provisioners or the normal provisioners don't really work within the plan phase is a weird quirk, and you just, well, again, that it does work, but it just feels weird every time you were using it. It didn't feel very terraformy at all.
It does. It's really one of those, like, every time I talk about like infrastructure as code and item potency and immutability, it's like, then you get to provisioners and it's like, this breaks like all the rules. It's always kind of awkward from that aspect, but it's really one of those features that is really something that's really needed. Because like at least in my history, like I managed the VMware environment. I never really got into the operating system. Like that was a different team that managed that. So like I could make my infrastructure immutable from the vSphere level, but there was always that one, like that handoff bit. And like, how do we automate this process? How do I build it into my workflow to support that? And remote provisioners, or provisioners in general was a great way to do that, because we could just kind of float that right in and didn't have to worry about baking that into a golden template or image. So it's great functionality that's very much needed, even though it kind of doesn't fall underneath the whole like Terraformy way and feel.
Yeah, it's nice. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to stop the stream now.